So I'm finally getting to the point where I've at least put the strings on this very cheap Stratocaster copy that I received from my neighbour, or one of my neighbours, somebody who lives nearby, who just stopped me in the road, and we've been chatting for a while. He's a nice fellow. And I happened to mention that I had a workshop. He wanted to know what I did in the workshop, and I didn't want to say that I just sit and think, which is my main workshop activity. So I told him that I was repairing a couple of guitars, which was more in the planning stage than the doing. One is my Yamaha, which I realise there's more work I can do on it. And the other one is my Charvel, Stratocaster, which is a very good guitar, and it just needs some love and attention. So I ended up getting roped in to repair his son's two guitars, which seemed straightforward, just to string up this Strat. But then the bridge was blocked because there was some stuff jammed in the string holes. I don't know what it was, and I had to drill it and all sorts of problems. But in the meantime, I had a translation job that I'd forgotten, and this can happen. It's rare, fortunately, but with a lot of different work coming in and schedules, sometimes a job might get forgotten. And if it gets forgotten, the only hope is that it's a short job and it can be done immediately. In my case, it was a long job and needed several days. And it was a difficult job and needed a couple more days. But it's in the middle of August, not much is happening in Italy, so I think I'm in the clear, and I've finished it and sent it off. And that held me up. I had various things on my plate. The trip to Norwich was the first one, then the exhaustion that followed that, and then my fence blew down at the front of the property, and I intend to fix that this morning. And one thing came to another, and I'd had this guitar for about a month at least, and had done nothing on it. I just hadn't had time. So I'm going to take some time off work, and I worked yesterday, and today I'm going to get the fence fixed. That's the main thing. There's so much work to do around the property if I'm going to prepare it for sale, which is what I would like to do, with a view to moving up to the north of England. And the main reason for moving up to the north of England, if I can find, a suitable house that's cheaper, that's the important thing, that I can put some money in my pocket. I don't know how much it'll be. But the main reason really is to be among my own people. When I first moved to Birmingham, I didn't think deeply upon this matter, and I was happy to speak to anybody. And I moved into a house, a shared house, which had a mixed residency, and it was owned by an Asian family from Pakistan. And he was a retired bus driver, and he had 3 daughters and 1 son. And his son was a bit of a bad un, I think, and his daughters were all very well employed as dentists and doctors and nurses. And he must have had a lot of money pouring in, and he'd bought the house next door to the house where he lived, and he used it to bolster his income. And I didn't know, because I rented it from Italy. I had no idea of local prices. I discovered later that the price was extremely high, that was being asked for the single room that I'd agreed to rent. But he was charging everybody quite a lot. We had no common room, so that's another thing with a shared house. Sometimes they'll leave the living room to have it as a shared area, but every single room in the house was occupied. I had the living room effectively. It was the nicest room in the house in some ways because it had a patio door out onto the garden. That's why I chose it. But electricity and bills and everything was on top. Again, in shared houses, certainly at the time, quite often electricity and bills would be included in the price. There was no internet, so every individual had to provide their own internet, or some agreement had to be reached, which I was unable to do because I was worried about my work. And it was just expensive, and it was in absolutely terrible condition. No money at all was spent upon this house. And I used to say to my father that we were kept like dogs in there, and we were. Now, there was another Asian man uh, who I got to know a little bit living there, and he was a nice fellow, a bit odd, but I thought that we'd maybe go out for a drink or something like that, or that he'd come down to the truth movement, but that was my first indication that there's not very much mixing between, just as a general rule, between the Asian people and the Brits. And he never he didn't wasn't interested in that. Then there was an English guy called Mick who came to live there for a while, and he was good. He played the guitar, and we had some good chats. But he moved out quite quickly. He had a motorbike. Then there was an Irish guy who was an aged professor at the university. Not that aged, younger than me probably, but not in good health. And his name was Dominic, I suppose. And he was very nice. We had some interesting chats. He was a Catholic, and I, at the time, was a raging anti-theist because I was still with Molyneux. So that led to some interesting talks. And then there was a West Indian woman that I remember very well that moved into the front room, and she was a young lass. She would have been in her mid-20s, maybe, early 20s. And she was a big girl. And she was a party girl, and she would be out on the vodka. And she had no money, this poor darling. She had nothing at all. She just lived from paycheck to paycheck. And she worked for a local shop. And she was nice. She was friendly, and she was treated so poorly, I thought. Because, again, her rent was high, and she'd been late in paying. And they told her that the next time she was late, it would increase. And sure enough, she was another day or two late, and they charged her extra money. It wasn't necessary because our landlord was a wealthy man, and I had to go round and take my rent once a month, and they wanted it in cash. So they were wealthy, but they were also screwing the Inland Revenue Service by not declaring everything that they were getting, and we had to pay in cash. And I used to go round to the house there, and they were nice people, I mean, I spoke to the daughters, and they were very pleasant. And I spoke to the elderly gentleman, and he was, as far as I could tell, he was a nice fellow. The daughter suggested that I have a talk to him about philosophy. She said her father would be most interested. And their house was beautiful. There was a white carpet. So, you had to take your shoes off before you went in. And beautiful, I was always ushered into the front room, which I suppose was the visitor's room. And I counted my money out onto a beautiful white sofa. And all the gold that they have in there, or just gold colours probably. And then back to my house next door to them, and it was just it really was in terrible condition. And I always remember that one of the fridges in the kitchen stopped working. The fridges, there was a sort of a wall of fridges in the kitchen and a freezer, and then a communal washing machine and a cooker, and those things were just, at the very past the end of their working life, were never replaced. The lino was cracked and peeling, the floor was filthy, and because it was down to us to clean it, of course. Well, I rolled up my sleeves and did what I could, but I was working with the place really needed refurbishing. And when the one fridge broke, and so we had problems, we didn't have enough space to put our food, I suppose. Because I haven't listed all the people that were there. I think when it was full, there was 5 of us living there. So there was an Indian fellow who came sort of straight from India, and he was training to be a doctor, and he was a Hindu. And he used to cut his hair in the bathroom and just leave it littered with his hair all over the place. I slightly objected to that. I might have mentioned it, or I didn't mention it to him, but I seem to remember that I made an ironic sign to put in the bathroom. I didn't like to have to deal with this man's hair. How could you do that? Unthinking. But we can all be unthinking. There's nothing racial. So I was living in a mixed race setting, and I was happy with that. But I did notice that I wasn't happy with the sort of the approach that the landlord took to the property. I was critical of that. I thought, well, he's really, everything is focused on making the maximum amount of money. That's what mattered. And really, it wasn't right that it should be so. And this gentleman was, they'd go to Pakistan in the summer, or in a certain time of the year, whenever the weather was good over there. I can't remember what time of the year it was, and disappear for 3 or 4 months even. The old couple who owned the property, and my Irish rather friend Dom had been to their house in Pakistan. So I understood. I think they'd asked him if he could look after it or something like that for a moment. He was a nice fellow, but a little bit lost, head in the clouds kind of fellow. Probably got a lot of money as well, and to be living in a property like that showed that he was more of a social misfit, I suppose. I think he was doing it to save money, but he didn't need really to save money, because he had his own house in the south of Ireland, although it wasn't in great condition, he told me. But I mean, he was working. I don't know whether he was a professor. He might have been an assistant, a language assistant at Birmingham University. He'd have had a good salary. These places are called bedsit. It's not a bedsit salary that he'd have been on. He could have easily got his own house, his own flat at least. But he chose to live there, and he knew the couple. He'd been there for many years, and they had an affectionate relationship, he thought, or might have seemed. Although he did confide to me that when he'd gone over to stay there and look after the property, or whether it was that one or whether it was their own house, at a certain point they questioned him about some jewellery that they couldn't find, and had he seen it. And he was, a little bit, I suppose, how would you feel, embarrassed, because it's embarrassing to be asked those sorts of questions. He wasn't the sort of man to steal jewellery, I'm sure of that. And yet, I suppose, that's the trouble with letting people into your house and leaving them alone. If you're not a trusting, if you do that, anything that goes missing is yours, and you've lost it. You would never, because it's your own judgment, you see, that you're questioning. But then it turned out that other family members had keys, of course, and so maybe the stuff had been spirited away somehow. Certainly it was nothing to do with my friend, who has now passed on to a better life, or I hope. He didn't live for long after I knew him. And when I rented my own flat after that first year, I rented it from one of my kinfolk, a woman, and she gave me a fair rent. And the rent that I was paying was only £50 more than the rent I'd been paying for a single room, and yet now I had my own living room, my own bedroom, a bathroom and a kitchen, and also a French door leading onto the garden for £50 more. So that was how, you know, well, how fair my landlady was, and how unfair my previous landlord had been, I would have to say. Um, it's more expensive only because I had to pay council tax, um, which covers rates and things like that. And it wasn't very much actually. It's probably about £60 or £70 a month that you have to add on to the bill. And then I had my own electricity contract. There was no gas in the building, and I had my own internet contract, which I had already. So it was just the electricity, but I paid for that anyway, you see. So just an idea of the level of fairness that was at play here. I wasn't happy with that, and I've met the people. I've met both of the daughters in the street since I left, and I chat to them. We're friendly, I would like to think. I certainly don't have anything, personally against them. I just think there's a philosophical question at heart, and I since started chatting as I started to meet more people, and I chatted to another woman that I'd come to know who was one of my own kinfolk, and she had properties that she let, and she was quite a shrewd woman and hard-nosed, I would say, but she confirmed things that I'd been hearing from other of my own people, that you didn't really want to get into a property if it was being let by Asian people, because it was the sort of sharp practices and that were very common. I didn't know that. But I have to say that my experience seemed to confirm it. Of course, people vary from individual to individual. I don't want to paint this with a broad brush at all, but so it is. And so, the racial situation here is very divided, I suppose. And I managed to be a bit of an outlier because my next door neighbour in the flat, after a while, was a white Muslim man, a man about 10 years older than I, who had become a Muslim. And, he was very devout. And he had several young sort of hardcore Muslim friends who used to come round. And so I got to meet these guys, and they were the typical guys that we were told at the time were organising bombs here and there. And there was three of these fellows that came round. They all had long, bushy beards, and they were quite young. And you couldn't have wished to meet three nicer young fellows. I realized that after a bit. They were devout because they were trying to find the truth, you see, and they'd been told all this stuff, and so they were trying to be good Muslims. They laughed about all this terrorism stuff. They just said it was nonsense themselves. They didn't believe in that stuff. And they used to smoke dope. So I already knew that they would be up my street, and they were nice fellows. So that was really interesting to me to see that difference, and to see the religious aspect also in some detail. I don't think these are people. You see, the trouble is that the mosques are worse than the churches, if it's possible. They're just, it's just Freemasonry under a different name. That's all religions are. I'm sorry to have to say. That's why the authorized version is so important. You can't go anywhere else. But we do have that, you see. And the Muslims will get no respite from their Quran, which is just a book of works to be recited and learned and recited and repeated, and praise and praise and praise to this false god, while turning their back on the true God, our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ, and calling him a prophet. It doesn't really bear thinking about, does it? So that's what I'm doing. I've got to work today, and I'm going to set about trying to clean up the property and prepare it for sale, because ultimately it is a racial thing that's making me move. Sure, I need some cash, and to free up some cash would be good. But there's other places where I could live around the world that would allow me to free up some cash. But I want to be with my people somewhere. And I know that they'll probably be ornery and worse than me, but they'll be my people. That's what I want. God bless.